alaikum. Namaste. Sat Sri Akal. Allahu Akbar. And Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to Sabeel Center. It's always gratifying to have new friends at our events, and we are often asked to introduce the Sabeel Center. So for those of you who have been here before, bear with me for one more minute. Sabeel Center is owned by Ifanka, a 40-year-old organization known for halal certification. It's a global leader in halal certification, halal education, and other related fields. Sabeel Center used to be a synagogue. As the Jewish population moved further west, the place was left vacant. Ifanka bought it about 7 years ago, and what you're looking at today, and I've gotten very positive comments. Every time we get very positive comments, it took us 7 years to get here. A lot of people work very hard within the Ifanka community, Ifanka family of workers, to take us to this level. Sabeel Center has 4 strategic objectives that we keep in mind, and anything and everything we do is related to that. First of all, the center is dedicated to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Anything and everything we do, including what we are doing tonight, is related to him. So the 4 objectives are a lecture series, a gallery exhibit that we have been working on for 2 years. We have 4 of them installed throughout the place, and there are 14 more that we are working on at the time. Besides those 2, we plan to have seniors programming. Seniors are often ignored in our community, and to me that's a precious, precious, precious generation. May Allah grant them healthier, longer, happier lives, and we need to gain a lot from them. And finally, but not in the least, we have halal kitchen. You can see the kitchen in the back behind that window. It's halal in the sense, well, there's nothing halal about the kitchen itself, it's equipment. But this is where we plan to offer halal cooking classes from. The target audiences that we have are little kids, middle schoolers, adults, and executive chefs. So those are the 4 objectives. Here's a story. When I was thinking about this project, when I came across this several months ago, wanted to relate it to something in the Qur'an, something in the Islamic history. And here's a story that I came up with from the Islamic literature. Prophet Moses, peace be upon him, known to be very aggressive in Islamic literature. He once saw a shepherd herding his animals. The shepherd was in his own way talking to God. He was asking God to come down to him, make himself visible to him, so that he could feed him the milk of his best goats, so that he could comb his hair, put the best oil that he could find on his hair. Prophet Moses, being aggressive that he was, didn't like any of this. So the shepherd had essentially, effectively anthropomorphized God. And Prophet Moses went to him and said, this is nonsense, what are you doing? God doesn't need any of this. He's not in need of oil or milk or anything. And the shepherd was very dejected, obviously, and walked away. And a revelation came, saying, I sent you to bring my people closer to me. What the shepherd was saying was the highest intellectual level that he could muster, and you turned him away. So Quranic literature is not without instances where prophets, including Prophet Muhammad, were chastised in the Quran. So this was one of those stories. What does that have to do with today's exhibit? Well, this exhibit brings people closer to what Quran is supposed to be, but I'm not going to talk much about it. Sandal Burke will talk about it. What I will talk about it is that, to me, this is democratization of the Quran, as far as American people are concerned. And by American people, I mean all of us, Muslims and non-Muslims and everyone else in between. Most of the Quranic exhibits that we have been to are full of ornate, highly illuminated manuscripts of the Quran, books that are often commissioned by emperors and kings and sit in museums, hardly ever touched by ordinary human beings. That's not the purpose of the Quran. When Quran was revealed, it shattered the social structure of the society. Why? Because now you could talk directly to God, who was talking directly to you. That turned the whole society upside down. In a way, that's what Sandal Burke has accomplished and he's doing here. He has made paintings of all 114 chapters, surahs of the Quran. Those 114 chapters are scattered all over the globe, including some in private collections. So obviously we couldn't get, it's humanly impossible to get all of them together. But thankfully, 11 of them were available as a set at Catherine Clark Gallery in San Francisco. So we are launching this exhibit from the gallery for the next 2.5 months. Tonight is only the opening night. I sent an video to those of you who had RSVP'd for this event. It was hastily made. I'm very disappointed with my performance, so we'll do better in the future. But you get what you pay for, right? Not bad for a debut performance. But the whole point of that video was to introduce the work to you so as to maximize your time here. So we have 11 surahs and a ceramic tile, a mihrab outside. The surahs are arranged in no particular order. They're all together, so it's cohesive in that sense. But the way they're arranged is a function of the space on each wall that we had available. I started thinking about hosting such an exhibit here several months ago, and I talked to a number of my friends. Their insights, their thoughts, whether I agreed with it or not, were very, very helpful, and I'd like to recognize them because I don't take those things for granted. Dr. Karen Hunt Ahmed, Adnan Arayan, Yvonne Maffei, Zafar Malik, and last but not in the least, Aman Sardar Malik. Your views, your insights, your thoughts meant a lot to me. I'm typically the least educated person in the room, but I always learn by being in your company. So thank you very much, especially Adnan, who saw this in San Francisco several years ago. I've often been commented on, let's put it mildly, for requiring people to RSVP. Yes, I'm a bit stickler for it. For those of us who are Muslims, it's also a tradition of the Prophet to not only RSVP, but also honor it once you do so. So those of you who are doing this, thank you so much. It makes planning so much easier. And it really breaks your heart when you get excited about seeing a friend or a new friend RSVP and then they don't even show up. That's not cool. Let's put it that way. And those of you who do that, thank you so much. It's always great to see a friend RSVP. It gets exciting. I mean, that's how, it's nerdy, but that's what it is. You also got an email about a casual dinner on Divan after this event. So those of you who didn't read my email, take it out of your spam, read it. It says a casual dinner with Sandow Burke and his wife, Elise, on Divan at Anmol. We'll probably leave here before 9 and then be there by 9:30. They're open till midnight. The agenda, once again, is that we've already prayed Asr prayers. After me, Professor Marcia Hermanson will speak about Sandow's work, followed by Sandow's presentation, followed by Q&A. We have allowed at least half hour for Q&A. Then there will be book signing. If you have brought a book here to this exhibit, we don't have any books to sell because that's just logistically too cumbersome. So if you bought a book and brought it here, Sandow will be happy to sign it to you. The one that you see there belongs to Nafisa Rizvi. It's not for sale. And she told me no one touches it. So that's very threatening and ominous, and she's a very dangerous looking woman. So the exhibit, this is just the opening night. We have it here at Sabeel Center till late September. Hopefully on Monday, if not before, you will get a mass email from me. So don't flatter yourself, it goes out to anyone and everyone who's ever said salam or hi to me. It will be about the exhibit that's going to be here. There will be opportunity almost 4 or 5 times, at least 4 if not 5 times every week for the next 11 weeks. So there will be about 40 plus opportunities for you to register and come and view it. It would be great if you can do it in a group. With that, I'd like to introduce Professor Marcia Hermanson. Professor Hermanson is Director of Islamic Studies at Loyola University. She's a fellow University of Chicago, PhD. And this is a personal note. I'm happy to see at least 5 University of Chicago alumni and a professor, former professor, so we should have a separate picture with the artist later on. That's my personal bias. Professor Hermansen.
Thank you very much, Rizwan and the Sabeel Center. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This evening, I have the honor of briefly introducing this exhibit of pages from the American Qur'an. Recently, in fact, it was just a couple of days ago, I heard a presentation on the strategy of teaching a subject, especially a novel subject. And one principle of such teaching that I think is especially relevant to our experience tonight of the American Qur'an is making the strange familiar and the familiar strange. That's very impactful to get something across. You thought you knew it, all of a sudden it's strange. Or you thought, no, I have nothing to do with this, and it becomes your own. In this context, I'm reminded of the hadith, or saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Islam began as something strange and will return to being strange. So give good tidings to the strangers. Bada al-Islamu ghariban wa sa-ya'udu ghariban kama bada. Fatuba lil ghurba. The American Qur'an project of Sabeel Center may initially come off as strange for many Muslims, as well as for many Americans, for different reasons. While there is a tradition of illuminating Qur'an manuscripts with elaborate calligraphy and geometric designs around the borders of pages, American Qur'an features the entire text written out in English translation, while each page is set within borders featuring scenes from modern American life, almost reminiscent of Norman Rockwell tableaus. This is, of course, startling for Muslims who expect a prohibition on representing living things, if not completely, at least in conjunction with sacred or religious contexts. On the other hand, for Americans unfamiliar with Islam and Muslims, the Qur'an itself might be perceived as an ancient, exotic, and alien text, remote, and even potentially sinister. So to find it peopled with scenes from familiar American spaces is likewise novel and provocative. Thus, the American Qur'an Project offers multiple audiences the opportunity to encounter the familiar in a new light and to make connections with what was formerly alien. Sabeel Center is an artist who spent about 9 years, 2005 to 2014, first writing out the English translation in a script that has been described as reminiscent of graffiti in his native Los Angeles. And then, having encountered illustrated Qur'an manuscripts in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, he was inspired to painstakingly illuminate pages of the work to produce a contemporary illustrated version of the text. This project, American Qur'an, unlike the pre-modern tradition of illuminated manuscripts, is not confined to the interior pages of these manuscripts that were funded and consumed by elites only, but rather it has a more public presence, as we will see in tonight's exhibit, and a more broad availability. You can purchase the volume on Amazon for an incredibly reasonable price, and you see how impressive and huge that volume is, so check it out on Amazon. Why make the American Qur'an both public and familiar? Sandow Birk, from whom we will be privileged to hear in person after my brief introduction, can best answer that question. But based on some biographical sources available to me, several intriguing connections come to mind, which he's welcome to reject or accept. The first is Burke's background as a surfer. The Qur'an itself invites humanity to reflect and contemplate. And what is so often the starting point in the Qur'an is the rhythms of nature. I imagine that the sensibilities of a surfer might readily attune to this interplay and mystery of natural rhythms, so familiar and yet so profound. For example, Qur'an 45 verse 5, in the succession of night and day, in the means of subsistence which God sends down from the skies, giving life to the earth after it had been lifeless, and in the change of the winds. In all of this, there are messages for people who use their reason. So that was number one connection. Number two, often cited in the literature, and by the way, this is very important work. There is already a rich tradition of commentary, not only on American Qur'an, on the oeuvre of Burke, but there are like academic articles, a chapter in the book on English translations of the Qur'an by the noted academic Bruce Lawrence. So I'm able to draw on this rich tradition of very well-known public intellectuals like Reza Aslan and Zarina Graywell have also written chapters as part of the American Qur'an book. So I can draw on some of that in bringing insights to you. So the second connection, there are three. The second connection I want to make is that this project has been said in interviews with the artist to emerge from reacting to the negative image and situation of Muslims in America after the 9/11 attacks. The everyday activities of Americans in the illustrations that you're going to be able to see. Americans going about their occupations, celebrating, commemorating life cycle rituals, births, weddings, funerals, interacting with each other in ordinary situations, populating scenes from recent history. All of this situates the Qur'an in human encounters and also serves to humanize Muslims through making their scripture part of American life and American experience. How strange that the specifics and limitations of time and space are transcended and conjoined with the mythic language and symbols of the Qur'an, such that the book continues to find a home in our here and now. But isn't that the function of scripture as eternal time continues to touch and illuminate our present moment? Thirdly, I'd like to note some connections of the American Qur'an project to Burke's previous work. Those who have studied and written about his art note his persistent interest in topics such as class dynamics, social justice, ethnic diversity, and immigration. One art critic, Rebecca Solnit, in the prestigious London Review of Books, writes, quote, Sandow Birk, early in his career, restaged great watery history paintings, such as the Raft of the Medusa, and now we're getting ready for our first slide. I just have two images to show you. Washington crossing the Delaware. So I'm going to briefly show, once the PowerPoint is open, Bert's rendition. And I don't know how well you can see. Well, somebody was going to, yeah, just fine. Okay, North Swell, Washington, crossing the Delaware, a work from 1990 or 1990s approximately. So this idea of bringing history and epic into the present so that we connect with it. And here the figures are rendered in a surfing context. So I thought that that was a very interesting strategy. In addition, okay, I'm quoting the critic. This is not my writing. In addition, he painted a brilliant series in Smog and Thunder, historical works from the Great War of the Californias, in which cultural clashes between San Francisco and Los Angeles were depicted as a multi-ethnic battle, complete with fast food sponsors and gang colors. Another series, Incarcerated Visions of California in the 21st Century, inspected California's heaven and hell, representing all 33 state prisons. A major project of the early 2000s was Bert's version of Dante's Divine Comedy, with illustrations from Los Angeles, San Francisco, and even other world locations. And this is the second slide, which even shows maybe almost as a transition to the illuminated Qur'an. So this is an illustration from one part of the Dante's Inferno project, but you see here clearly overlooking Mecca. So I'm just trying, very briefly to raise that idea of continuity. All this makes me suspect that his project on the Qur'an is dealing with consistent theological preoccupations and questions of meaning, which I hope to hear more about. We are exceptionally privileged tonight, not only to hear Sabeel Bert in person, but to encounter some of his original illustrations in the Sabeel Gallery, to be able to have our own experiences and form our own impressions of them, and to allow them to provoke in us, as Muslims and Americans, fresh and potentially transformative insights into both America and the Qur'an. Blessed are the strangers. Thank you.
What a wonderful introduction. Thank you, Professor Hermansen. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sabeel Berg. Sabeel. After his presentation, we'll have Q&A, and we'll break at 8:30 for Maghrib prayers. Those of you who want to pray, it's downstairs.
Hi.
Ladies and gentlemen, Sabeel Berg.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for having me. I'm not as professional a speaker as the others. I'm a painter. And I want to thank Rizwan for bringing me here. He's worked really hard to bring this show here. You already have sort of learned a lot about it, but it's been a 9-year project. It's been organized into several different exhibitions. It's been shown in different places around the United States, 8 or 10 times. But this is the first time it's ever been specifically shown in a Muslim cultural center. So it's interesting to me, and I hope it's interesting to you. I'm sure you have a lot of questions. Usually when people hear about this project, the number one thing they want to know is, like, why did I do this? So I'm going to run through some slides and try to quickly explain what I did and why. I grew up in the suburbs of Los Angeles. I started surfing when I was 11 years old, and I'm mentioning it because it turns out that it's going to be important. But I've been surfing ever since I was 11, I still surf all the time. Now my wife and my kids surf. It's a big part of just our sort of normal life routine. And pretty much since high school, I spent a lot of time traveling to different parts of the world to go surfing, just because I like it. I went to art school in downtown Los Angeles. I did an exchange year. I did a half a year at art school in Paris and another half at art school in Bath in England. I lived in Brazil for a while. I came back to Los Angeles and finished school, and as she was speaking about, the first real paintings that I started to do after being out of school and they started getting attention were big paintings about surfing, and trying to change the idea that surfing was some sort of teenage, silly, fun beach activity and show that surfing is actually an activity that comes from this long history of the ocean and exploring and fishermen and maritime, things like that. So I was doing paintings that were largely based on the paintings and things that I had seen in art school when I was in Europe and doing sort of Americanized versions of them. I was living in bad parts of Los Angeles because I was a starving artist and didn't have much money, and doing these surfing paintings, and then gradually I started doing paintings about the neighborhoods that I was living in. This was in the early 90s, and I did a series of paintings about gang wars and drug deals and the riots in Los Angeles that happened in 1992. So, and I started to get sort of known for these paintings, especially after the riots happened. And so what I'm trying to show is I sort of developed this way of working where I looked at things from art history and thought about how art works today might deal with our life today. Gradually I started to do these projects where I would get a small idea and then it would become a bigger idea and become like a multiple long year project. As she mentioned, I did a whole series of paintings about a fictional war between San Francisco and Los Angeles that started as one little joke and became a 5-year-long project. Later I stumbled on a copy of Dante's Inferno in a used bookstore, and that led to a 5-year project in which I worked with a writer and we rewrote the entire Divine Comedy into American slang, and I illustrated it, and it became three books and eventually a feature-length movie that we made, Dante's Inferno, all done with puppets. So I start with these small ideas and they sort of grow out of control, is how I work. At some point, I got a phone call from this print shop in Hawaii, a guy named Paul Maloney, and he said, why don't you come over to Hawaii and be a visiting artist and do a series of prints? And I said, I don't really have any ideas what they should be about, and he said, it doesn't matter, just come over anyway, and we'll see what develops. So we went over to the print shop, my wife and I. This is his print shop in Maui. And I started looking through his books about the history of printmaking and got interested. This was when the war in Iraq was going on, and I was quite upset about it when George Bush was president. And I started looking at the Goya prints that are well known from the 1800s, and that led me to looking at a series of prints by Jacques Callot from the 1600s called Disasters of War. These really amazing, tiny little prints about the history of the 30 Years' War in Europe. And so I said to the printer, why don't we do a series of little prints based on Jacques Callot's prints about the war in Iraq? And my wife Elise said, that's okay, but instead of making little prints based on little prints, why don't you make really big prints based on little prints? And Paul the printer said, that's a great idea. And we went down to the Home Depot in Hawaii and we bought these giant sheets of plywood and we started doing a series of woodblock prints about the war in Iraq. This is me and my wife carving them. And from that little idea, again, it became almost a 2-year-long project. And we did a series of 15 giant woodblock prints that told the story of the war in Iraq, from starting with starting with the attacks of 9/11 and then going on to and then here you see, that's Paul the printer who's wiping his brow. That's my wife Elise. And on the table you can see one of the wood blocks and how large they are. The whole project became called The Depravities of War. And it started with 9/11, and then it showed the Americans training and then going off to war, and then sort of major events from the war. This is the Battle for Fallujah. This is the Americans rounding up all the people and taking them off to Abu Ghraib prison. But it became a whole sequential series, and it ended up with a Senate investigation into the mishandling of everything, and finally with the execution of Saddam Hussein. So this was a big project. It went from a little idea to becoming a 2-year-long project that we worked on. We would go back and forth to Hawaii and carve these blocks and print them and go back and forth and do some more. But basically for 2 years, everything I was thinking about was the war in Iraq. I was reading about it, and I was following it in the newspaper, and trying to protest wherever I could, and just being obsessed with the war in Iraq and listening constantly to the radio and all the discussion going on in America about, what is Islam? Is Islam a violent religion? Is it a East versus West war? Is it fundamentally at odds with Western civilization? And all these different things, and listening to them constantly back and forth, and I started to think, wait a second, this doesn't, I've been to Islamic parts of the world, and I've never had any experiences like this, and the way that Americans are talking about Islam is nothing like the personal experiences I've had. This is the show of the prints in Portland, and actually all 15 of the prints were shown here in Chicago at the cultural, I don't know the official name of it, the old library that's the Chicago Cultural Center. They were shown there maybe 7, 8 years ago. But anyway, I'm thinking about the way Americans are talking about Islam, and I started thinking, wait, I've been to Islamic places, and it's nothing like the way Americans are talking about. And I started counting all the places I'd been on surfing trips. I think I counted 10 long trips to different parts of the Islamic world. For example, this is a mosque in Java, where we've been to Indonesia, I think 6 or 7 times. This is surfing in Java. This is a mosque in the Philippines. My wife's mother is Filipina, and we went to the Philippines to visit her family. And this is me surfing in the Philippines. This is Tangier in Morocco. And this is me surfing in Morocco. So there's a theme. This is me and a friend of mine in front of the mosque in Casablanca. So these are places I had already been, and I had these wonderful experiences and met wonderful people and gone to museums and visited mosques as a tourist and had wonderful food. And so I'm listening to this whole American discussion and saying, Americans don't know anything what they're talking about, and neither do I. So I went down to the end of the street and bought a copy of the Qur'an at the local bookstore, and I just started reading it. And I started reading the Qur'an myself, and I started reading about the Qur'an, and since I'm an artist, I started going to art history books and looking at historic Qur'ans, which were really interesting to me. And I started to have this idea that, that maybe I could make a Qur'an myself. I was interested as an artist in this idea of, how 500 years ago someone would sit in a room and transcribe it in medieval times and sew these pages together and make these gorgeous manuscripts. And I thought, this is something that isn't done in the age of videos and photography and things, but this is something that an artist like me could do. It's a handmade thing, and maybe it's something that I could do. And then I kept looking at all these beautiful historic Qur'ans, and it seemed crazy. I thought, there's no way I can make a Qur'an as beautiful as these historic ones. And then I sort of put this idea aside, But then I was on another surfing trip to Ireland, and I was wandering around Dublin on a rainy day and stumbled upon the Chester Beatty Library almost by accident, and went inside, and they had 1,000 years of Qur'ans laid out in these cases, and I was just blown away at not only to see them in person, but to see how beautiful they were. And the thing that really struck me as an artist was, whereas at home I had been looking at library books, and you're seeing these reproductions of them, and they look so perfect, like little jewels, and they seemed so unbelievably perfect that nobody could actually make them. When I went to the Chester Beatty Library and actually saw real ones, you see that in real life that they're not as perfect as they look. There's little mistakes, and they fix things, and they scratch out part. There was one, they actually did the same page twice, but they had spent so much time on it that they just drew a line through it and kept it in the book because they didn't want to throw it away. So you started to see that these are these really beautiful handmade books, and how charming they were, and how human they were. And from that, I got the idea, well, maybe it is something that I could do. These are like the beautiful ones they have at Chester Beatty Library. And Persian paintings, I started traveling around the museums in LA and looking at Persian artwork anywhere I could. But from that little crazy idea, maybe I could make a Qur'an, that's how it started. And so I began, after, this had been about a year of my sort of learning about Qur'ans and reading about them and reading the Qur'an itself. And so obviously I knew how important calligraphy is in the Islamic world. So I started to think, well, if I'm going to write it with my own hands, I need to come up with some kind of calligraphy that's important. And I thought, well, who in the 20th century is the calligraphers of America? And I thought, well, graffiti writers. They spend all their time practicing letters and thinking about letters. And so I looked at traditional, like Mexican, California graffiti, and I came up with my own alphabet to use. And from that crazy idea, I sat down and I started transcribing the entire text of the Qur'an in English. And the way I would do it, I would go surah by surah. I didn't go in sequence because, as you know, they weren't revealed in sequence. It wasn't necessary for them to be in sequence. So I would generally do a short one and then a long one and a short one and a long one. And I would start by transcribing the text in English. And then when it was done, I would, well, hopefully during the several days that took, the text itself would lend sort of to me, an image would come to me, some metaphorical scene of life in the United States. And I would paint the scene around the text that was already existing. And the basic idea was that every page would have a scene of life in the United States today that is a metaphor for the passages of the Qur'an, with the general idea to make the Qur'an seem more familiar to Americans, to non-Muslim Americans, more accessible, to make it seem more part of American life. And, I guess what I did sort of by myself is I was reading the Qur'an, and the Qur'an says, the Qur'an is a message sent down from God to all human beings. And I thought, well, I'm a human being, and I live in California in the 20th century, the 21st century, and I'm like, well, what does this message mean to me when I read it? What does this message mean when I'm sitting here quietly pondering it, but also when I stop at the ATM machine and go to the grocery store, put gas in the car, pick up my kids from school? What does this spiritual message mean in my daily life? And so the results are what you see around you. Sometimes the connection between my imagery and the text is sort of obvious, and sometimes it's less obvious. This is an example of an obvious one in which it's a passage about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and you can see it's like a Hollywood movie, and they're shooting a movie about Adam and Eve, and you can barely see Adam and Eve in the center. This is a passage about Noah building the ark. And so it's a guy maybe in Seattle building a canoe in his driveway. And another idea that I had was I wanted to make at least one page from all of the 50 states. so that the whole project, when it was finished, was sort of a pan-American, so that every part of the United States was included. This is another passage about the flood, Noah and the flood. And often you're reading the Bible or the Qur'an, and there's these it's describing something like the entire world's being flooded and everyone's dead except the people on the boat. And you can't really imagine what could that look like. But it was not hard to remember what New Orleans looked like when it was all underwater. As you know, much of the Quran has repetitive passages that keep reminding us that this is a message that's coming down from God, it's being sent down from the sky. So I did lots of images of people putting up satellite dishes and telephone lines and newspaper distribution, and sort of the way that messages are conveyed around the world in our times, but coming from the sky like that. Or the way graffiti writers put marks around the city that mean things to other graffiti writers. This is the scene of Chicago. This is the passages that talk about taking the veil. And so I thought, well, who besides Muslims, when do Americans wear the veil? Oh, really cold days in Chicago. So here you see people crossing the bridge of the river. The passages about Mary. The neighborhood I live in LA is a Hispanic neighborhood, and a lot of the bodega stores around have paintings of Virgin Guadalupe on them. And this is like a Baptist church, in passages that talk about the other religions in the world. A lot of scenes of the ceremonies of American life, funerals, births, marriages. And to me personally, some of the strongest images were ones where there was a real clear connection between the passage in the Quran and something that's happening in our times, like the flood in New Orleans. It's sort of obvious, but I think that's such a really good connection. And this is the story of the men in the cave, and I did it shortly after the Big Branch mine disaster, where the miners were trapped in West Virginia in the mine for several days. And it was such a great metaphor. I think there was 7 men were trapped in the mine in Virginia, exactly as the same as the 7 men in the story. This is the scene of, I'm not familiar, again, can't recall all the stories, but this is the part where Moses goes down the river with the Al-Qadir or something. So you see they're going down the river and the boat is labeled Al-Qadir. This is building a wall in the passage about Gog and Magog, and they build a wall to prevent the marauders. And often the Quran talks, it says, remember, that God has destroyed civilizations that came before yours, and that's a sign to you. And so this is a scene of when the Americans bombed Nagasaki. So the Americans themselves wiped out almost a whole civilization there. And finally, for the very last surahs, I brought it back to my own personal life in my daily surfing routine. And there's a colophon. The book is finished, praise be to God. So when I began the project, I thought, I went to the galleries that I work with and I said, I'm thinking about doing this project. And they were like, well, how are you going to have any income, and how is this going to be feasible as an art show? And so the way that we figured out to do it was that I would work on it over the years, and I would do about 30 or 40 pages, and when I got those done, we'd have an art show of them like this, and then they would sell them, and they would sell them that you had to buy the entire surah, so they tried to keep the surahs together. And originally I thought the project would take me 4 years, and it ended up taking 9 years, but now it's finished, and it's published, and Praise be to God. Very lastly, this is a picture. It's been when it was finished, it became 240 pages. They were all brought together into one giant exhibition, which was first at the Newport Orange County Museum of Art in California, and then it traveled to the Jordan Schnitzer Museum in Oregon. And this is a picture of what it looked like there. My wife Elise does ceramics. She's an artist, and every time we've shown the project, I've worked with her to make a mihrab, and we've always installed it in the gallery so that it's facing the proper direction. And this is a scene in Oregon, and she created this 14-foot tall one, and it's using passages that I found important to me. Whoever saves the life of another surely saves the lives of all humanity. And then again, we were thinking, you know, in a daily American life, a mihrab is like a niche in the wall, generally. In daily American life, what sort of thing does an average American niche does an average American confront?
ATM.
And if you look, it's an ATM machine. So that's what I brought.
Why don't you introduce Elise also? Elise, would you please stand up? To the front of this side. As I said in my comments, the ceramic tile that you see outside, right above the stairs as you come up, is by Elise. And it has 2 Quranic ayahs on either side of it. We'll start our Q&A in a second. But before that, I have a little gift for you. Send our, this was really a blessing and a great event. Thanks for making it happen. We've been talking about it for the longest time, it seemed, but in the end it all worked out. And as a very small token of our appreciation, we'd like to present this to you. Small plaque that says, Sabeel Center presents to Senda Berg in grateful appreciation of your presentation at the opening night of a modern artistic rendition of Quranic stories, The American Qur'an, Saturday, July 14, 2018. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
While they're getting ready with the microphone, let me remind you of a couple of basic etiquettes of Q&A. All of you are highly intelligent and can give a presentation much better than what I did at the beginning of the event. So, but this is Q&A, not commentary and answers. So please limit your thoughts to a comment or a question, and allow Senda to expand more on it. So, raise your hand. Switch side? Yeah. Musical chairs.
So thank you. Sandal, I have a comment. And I have 2 quick questions. I was privileged to talk to you earlier, so I had a little bit more insight than everyone else. So first of all, congratulations for amazing, very profound and creative work. And as a person, as a Muslim, I'm grateful and I'm inspired beyond words, I can tell you that. So thank you for doing all this work. My question is that I know as a Muslim how I'm reacting to it, and I think Rizwan mentioned earlier, it is democratization of Quran for me. It's really, Quran was meant to be an everyday life bringing values to us. And we Muslims have not treated it like that. We have kept it at arm's length. And you have brought it to our lives. So thank you for doing that and looking at Quran in a very different context. So I know how I'm reacting, and I think most Muslims will react that way. But I wanted to know how your non-Muslim Americans reacted to it, especially the ones who had a very different point of view about Islam. So if you can give us a little bit of insight on that.
Almost universally positively. It's been shown, like I said, maybe 10 times, and almost always positively. I think, it's a little bit preaching to the choir because it gets shown in art situations where people that like art come. It's not like average people walking down the street just pop in, although we hope that they would. So, but almost universally well received, and I travel often to universities and talk about it, and it's especially well received there. I find, teenage kids come up to me and they come up and say, like, I've lived my whole life in St. Louis, and I'm a skateboarder, and I'm a Muslim, and I've always felt like an outsider, and suddenly you're doing this project, and it puts my text and my daily life together, and it makes, they really appreciate it, so.
Great. Can I ask one quick question? I also asked you about what was one of the things which was a little bit surprising to you as you went through the Quran, and you shared that with me. Could you elaborate that for everyone as well?
Sure. I picked up the Quran knowing nothing about it, and as I told you earlier, I think that the very first thing that struck me was how familiar it was, how the stories are all the same that I've been familiar with, mostly from art history class. From Adam and Eve to Noah's Ark to Jesus and Mary to Moses to Abraham and Isaac, and so it was sort of amazing and happy to see how familiar it was.
Thank you.
You also talked about in one of your presentations about an anonymous email that was sent to you or to your organizers, and do you want to share that with the audience? This is perhaps the only objection that we know of that was ever raised.
Yeah, the very first time it was ever shown in San Francisco, the gallery got a couple of angry emails sent anonymously to them, but they were all saying that Americans shouldn't waste their time reading the Quran, and they shouldn't be promoting it, and they should take the show down. And so they were coming from angry right-wing people.
Nafisa Rizvi.
I hang on to this, so please be patient with me. One thing I want to ask is, why is your vision of America so white, Caucasian? I had a tough time finding a black person in there, or a Latino, or an Asian. There's one picture of a black man that I saw in there.
I would beg to differ. You have to remember there's 240 pages.
I looked through pretty much all of them. It was really tough finding a black person in there.
There's a Latino neighborhood in Surah in the back.
One.
And there are a few Asians here and there in different among these 11 surahs itself.
Okay, tell me the idea of the multiracial, multi-diverse, multicultural idea of America does not come through in your illustrations. Does it? Just tell me, what do you think?
Oh, I think so. I think if you look through the book, you will find mostly scenes of Hispanic Los Angeles where I live, and there's different races and different everything. For sure, for sure. For sure.
Okay. Just one more. Okay, I've sort of grown up with graphic designers, and I find your text completely difficult to read. And I know you're trying to go to the, it's in fact, it conflicts with the illustration, which is nice and edgy, and it's cool and it's hip and it's very today and it's on the street. And then you get that the graffiti idea doesn't sort of play with images, because it's not easy to read the text. It jars on you sometimes, and I find myself not being able to read the Quran, the text very easily. Have you had a problem with that? Has anyone else ever said that to you, or is it just me?
No one's ever said that.
Give up.
Sadio Kelly and Aman Sardar.
Stand up and thank you so much for both of you for doing that. I'm not waiting for the mic because it's coming, but I really moved. This project is, I'm an artist myself, and we happen to be sensitive people, maybe sometimes the soul of any society, which is how you took this project on, and any of the projects that you've taken on before this. Really appreciate it, really appreciate your hard work. Had two very quick questions. What is the percentage of, when you go out and give talks about this project, how many of those venues are for scholarly purposes? And this is mega artwork itself. And how many art schools and graphic design audiences are you reaching with this project?
I don't think I've spoken at art school about this, but at the museums where it was shown, at the galleries, so often at art institutions, and probably half the time at universities.
Fantastic. And the other question was, maybe the visual mind, I'm dying to see the plate under the writing also. So do you have those, or this is the finished piece? Was the visual one and then the writing on top? I'm a printmaker myself, so I'm thinking 3D. Do you have those full plates, or is this the final illustration and that's the only copy?
There is nothing behind it. I do the text first and the painting is done around it, but it's done with the intention that it looks like it goes behind.
So very much in the tradition of how the Qur'an was written, the writing and then the illustration around. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thanks for asking that question, Sadia. This is one of the first things that just about anybody I spoke with thought about, what's behind those writings. So Aman, would you please, Bonnie, excuse me. Aman, would you please stand up? So she's next, and then Bonnie. And I'd like the men to ask a question. Where are my people? That's half of humanity. No, Zan, over there in the back, please.
Oh.
Thanks.
Hi, first I'm really moved by your work. It was really inspiring. And one question that I had was that what inspired you to hide the entire illustration, and why have the text on top of it?
It's not hidden. There's nothing behind it. It's just painted around.
Yes.
And the very first pages I did, I would try to squeeze the little picture in the space that was around, but there's not enough space. So then I started to realize that if I did the painting so it looked like it went behind, that your brain would sort of fill in the picture and you get a bigger picture in your imagination that's actually on the page.
Okay. Thank you.
Bonnie, and then Adnan. You have to give men a chance also.
Did you make a series of prints, or is there only one of each of these?
There's only one of each. Yeah, these are hand painted.
Painted.
Yeah.
And you didn't do them as prints?
No.
The book.
The book.
The book.
Is the final.
And the book has everything.
Okay.
So yeah, the final version is the book, and it's this exact same size as the original.
If you open it.
And it's the entire Qur'an in English.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Adnan. Adnan, Ryan, and Sarah, then Farooq.
Thank you so much, Sendao, and thank you to the Sabeel Center and Rizwan. Really, really well done and very much appreciated. My question is, how did you decide on this particular style of art? I mean, obviously, I noticed that it's very much in keeping with your prior work, but I wonder how much of a consideration, for example, neoclassical or even abstract would have been, or did you ever, for example, consider a mix of different styles according to the content?
Yeah, I really looked at the historic Qur'ans, and especially at Persian painting. So I used the same material, so it's all done, following sort of the standard form of the Qur'an with the black text, and the palmette's done in gold. and then the paint is gouache, which is what's been used traditionally for hundreds of years. And then I often try to use this isometric perspective, that's sort of the tilted perspective that comes from Persian painting. So I try to keep it often looking like Persian painting or traditional Islamic works from the past. But then gradually I started to, evolve over a course of 9 years. Sort of learn different things and try different things.
Sarah, way up in the front.
I just want to thank you for this. It's fantastic. Really enjoyed looking at these. They're really great. And it may sound like a silly question you had mentioned earlier, but are any of these prints for sale?
These are all for sale. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Zen.
First, thank you so much. This was extremely informative, and to me, it's very eclectic. That's what the times are right now, and that's what you have done and shown. And I have children who have grown up here, and I can see how they would relate to it much more than the traditional Quran that they see, in the house, and would put their interest. And being in English is an added thing. So I think wonderful. Second thing that I was dying to ask you is this. I read Quran, I read the different translations. Different people have done different This is scholarly work. Marcia knows about it. Different interpretation. How difficult or challenging, I should say, was it to do it in English when you were translating?
I did not translate it.
No, I mean, okay, so tell me more about the process. I'm trying to see when you did it in English.
Well, I read it in English. I think I bought 6 or 8 different English translations.
Okay.
Mostly like Muhammad Asad, Thomas Cleary.
Right.
But then when I had the idea of doing the book, and I knew from having done previous books and talking with publishers that all those English translations are copyrighted. And so I had to use an English translation that was old enough that it was copyright free. So most of the translation that I used is by R.M. Rodwell from 1863, because I could use it legally. It's not my favorite one, but I was able to use it. And then I would read it in other translations as well.
Thank you.
Most of the translation I've read seemed to be in American English. So was that from Thomas Cleary, or was that from Rodwell's too? I never read Rodwell's translation, so I couldn't tell. But it seemed the translations are in American English, which was refreshing.
And from Muhammad Asad.
Okay. Farouk Khwaja in the middle, please. Please stand up so that Zen knows where you are. And then Kasaruddin, and then Professor Lems.
Thank you, Mr. Burke. Really fascinating, and you have done a great job. I wanted to ask you, in which type of art form would you like to put your work? I mean, the similar question was asked earlier. So, is it like contemporary, or is it abstract, or how do you want to describe it?
I consider myself to be a contemporary artist, an artist that's working in contemporary times. And I do different things. I generally consider myself to be a painter, but I also do drawings and paintings.
Okay, and the other thing is you chose to, put the translation in graffiti form. Is there something behind it, like something like the writing is on the wall, or something that you had in your head?
I don't understand.
Like graffiti.
Yeah.
So you chose that form to, write down all the translation and everything. So is it like you wanted to portray that there is some sort of writing on the wall?
Oh, I guess that's an interesting connection. Sure.
So did you think about it, or it was just...
I wanted to use a sort of font or style type that was from our time period, but still was meant to seem ornate and beautiful, I guess.
And the last question, have you already sent a copy to our president?
No.
Then Professor Lambs, and then Dr. Kasaruddin.
I heard he doesn't read.
That's for sure. You can send a tweet copy. I have two quick questions. One is, are there any surfers in the book?
Oh, yes.
Oh, several surfers?
Several. Yes.
That's cool. It's very genre busting, and I love the way it's both building on tradition and also really breaking tradition and trying something. I forgot the question, so thank you very much.
Dr. Kasaruddin here. Please stand up, Suzanne knows where you are. Then Michael Schmidt. One. Oh, sorry. This thing is blocking my view over there. Nothing biased.
Mr. Burke, a remarkable piece of work. Have you had any exhibition in any American art museum?
Yes. Of this project?
Right.
Yes, it was shown at the Orange County Museum of Art in Newport Beach, and it was also shown at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art in Oregon, and it has other exhibitions coming up.
Do you know what was the reaction of the common audience there?
Great. I think I think everyone found it surprising and interesting, and hopefully they learned something. I've always hoped that my project would lead people to know more about the Quran and then go on to learn even more with more scholarly English translations and learn more on their own.
Those of you who are interested, a number of Sandow's talks at these museums and other places are on YouTube. Those are extensive talks, very insightful, and the Q&A part is the most interesting. Zan, if you could go over to Dr. Kasaruddin and then Michael Schmidt. No, Dr. Kasaruddin and then Michael. Sorry.
Thank you very much for your detailed work, and very interesting. I don't think there has ever been a presentation like this of the Quran. I have some very simple questions. I understood from your answer to a previous question that this is your reading of several translations and then you adapted the translation as you see fits.
Not really. I used the R.M. Rodwell translation verbatim, but I read other translations to increase my own understanding of the text and the concepts.
And is this a complete Quran?
Yes.
From all 114 chapters?
Every word.
The ones we have here are only 11 surahs of the 114 because they're scattered all over the globe, so we could not get all 114. So we have 11 surahs here at Sabeel Center, but Sandow did all 114 chapters.
And has the translation been validated by any scholars of the Quran?
Yes. There's a new book that came out recently that she spoke about. Dr. Bruce Lawrence from Duke University has a new book out called The History of the Quran in English, and the final chapter of his book is all about my project.
Thank you.
Dr. Kasaruddin, just as a segue to Sandow's answer, I'm no scholar by any stretch of imagination, but as part of my job, I did read not all 114 surahs, but certainly the translation that's on the walls of these 11 surahs. And I didn't find anything that any ordinary American Muslim would find objectionable. So that's kind of a litmus test that we posed on ourselves, and we went through that. I don't know about the rest of the 103 surahs, but the 11 surahs, I did read the translation completely. Michael?
Thank you. At first, I'd like to mention, wow, it's an amazing project that you undertook, and congratulations on completing it. My only question is there anything in the Quran itself that struck you as, special? And when you finish the project, do you go back to the Quran? That's my main question.
I do. Yeah, I do. I hadn't looked at it for a couple months, and I pulled it out the other day, and I was pleased.
Was there anything particular that
I found, in really general terms, I found the Quran to be fascinating. I found the whole project to be super fascinating. It was so all-consuming to me for years. But every day that I sat down to work on it, I would read something new, and that would lead me to looking up something, and that would, down to Wiki, and then you're looking at a map of Medina, and then you're learning about how the archers were better in the battle than the other guys, and it was just this constantly learning and learning and learning. It was completely fascinating every day. I found it wonderful.
Thank you.
Zafar Malik. Kaisar, sorry, we have forgotten you. You had raised your hand for some time. Zafar Malik, Kaisar, and then Samana.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this wonderful project. When I first came out, I really was very excited about it. But over time, I thought, and this is not to take anything away from this, but I thought that, all translations actually date. And this work especially, it kind of is reductionist in some ways in terms of, dating it to now, or 5 years ago maybe. So, were there any discussions that took place when you were actually thinking of doing this? Whether this will be, these kind of things, these issues arise, and with especially with your Muslim advisors, did this come up in any way? And a second part of the thing is that, I saw Messenger of God, this film that was made. And because there is a prohibition to show the Prophet and other prophets and all that, in Islam. And I know that since I've seen that film, so there was a reason why there's been a prohibition. Since I saw that film, Hamza, who was Prophet's uncle, is always Anthony Quinn to me, and so is Bilal, the actor. So it kind of reduces our own imagination in some ways. So were these concerns at all, a part of this thing, of your?
Well, you have to remember, the idea is not to depict anyone in the Quran. It's to depict scenes of our life, or of my life, or our American life as it is today. So of course it's tied to today and to now. But it also, the idea wasn't to show this is how Muslims live in America. It wasn't that. It was to show this is how Americans live, and this is how this message might be meaningful to anyone's life in the daily activities that you go about. So.
Just the second part of it. So, do you think that maybe in 25 years you'd like to do another one?
No, I'd be happy for it to stand at the time period that it was done.
Kaisar, can you raise your hand, please? And then Samana, we have room for only two more questions. Sorry, folks, but we'll be around for a little bit.
Sando and Elise, thank you for coming here. Two kind of lighthearted questions for you regarding surfing. Obviously has a very specific worldview. Surfers all over the world sort of have that same view of the world. How did that affect, or did it affect at all, your illustration in terms of you being a surfer for such a long period of time? The second part of the question is a little bit easier. If you had to pick one place to go surfing, what would you pick?
Well, I don't know what one surfer's viewpoint you're talking about, but I would say the thing that surfing has done for me is that it's made me travel. Ever since I was in high school, we used to on weekends we'd drive down to Mexico and go camping and drive home. And then after going to Mexico, then I wanted to go to Guatemala and to Peru and to Brazil and just keep going further and further. And then I wanted to go to Europe and to Asia and Australia. And so my whole life has been spent traveling, you know, I guess for fun, you could say. But I think, as you all know from traveling yourselves, there's nothing better in life than to travel and see other cultures and be exposed to new things. And I think without having had those traveling experiences, I don't know that I would have come to this project.
Last question.
A tremendous contribution to their spiritual development, because it's always about making the text relevant. I think any spiritual text, whether it's the Qur'an or the Bible. So thank you for this work and effort you put into it. I had just two questions. First of all, you mentioned going to the museum in Dublin and seeing all these illuminated Qur'ans. And one of the things about, as far as I've seen in museums, there's never, of course, physical representation in the Qur'an itself. Like you mentioned the Persian miniatures, but there's never a representation of human beings or animals with the background of a Quranic text. So how did you kind of, how did you kind of work around that, or sort of say, well, how I'm using a text which is very traditionally wouldn't be illustrated in this manner, using depictions of physical forms?
Two answers to that. First of all, at the beginning, I just ignored it. I just put it out of my head. I'm an artist. I live in America. I paint pictures. That's what I do. And so I just started that way. But shortly after I began, I went and gave a talk at Cornell. And there I met Professor Shaukat Turawa. He teaches, he's an Islamic scholar at Cornell, and there's another guy there who wrote an introduction into my book. But he actually taught a whole class on imagery in the Quran, and he dug up, you know, centuries-old examples of pictures in the Qurans, including like maps on how to get to Mecca, and it was surprising. Obviously, very few, but few in the course of 1,000 years meant a couple hundred. So it's not unknown. And he pointed out that sort of the ban on imagery it was less strict in times past, and also it's regional around the world. In some places, like Singapore, is less interested in certain rules than Saudi Arabia. And part of the project is also about how Islam is a global religion. It's not just a Middle Eastern religion, but it spans the planet, and the differences between Muslims, between themselves, is vast in all parts of the world. So.
Yeah, my this last question was, I noticed a couple of this seems to be a theme that comes across. Like in one of the surahs about greed and exploitation, you have a picture of a home being foreclosed, right, which I thought was so relevant because in the housing bubble, everything that happened, was that intentional or just something that you said that you just kind of go with what was inspiring you as you wrote the text? Was it intentional, or was it inspirational, or both?
It was intentional. Yeah, it was absolutely intentional.
One last question by Rashid Chaudhry over there, but before that, I'd like to preface something here. First of all, Sumana, to your question, we are an Islamic institution. We don't wear it on who we are. So we looked at it from that perspective. And for us Muslims, there is only one Quran, and that's the Arabic text. Anything else, a translation, a painting, a depiction, any representation is subjective and someone's interpretation. I do not speak or read Arabic, so I have to rely on English or Urdu translations. So no matter how much I value a scholar's translation, it's still his or her interpretation. We use Lala Bakhtiar translation sometimes. So it's their interpretation. The Quran remains the Arabic text. So as such, I didn't see any conflict here at all, because there's an English translation, regardless of whose translation we use, and the depiction of any human figures didn't raise any conflict of interest. Before Rashid Chaudhry's question, I'd like to say something. There were some objections and concerns and issues raised about this project and Sabeel posting it. It's one thing to have a difference of opinion, it's another thing when it's a vociferous objection, and it came from people close to us, so we had to pay proper attention and respect to it. I was asked to go to the board of directors of Ivanka, the parent company, and come up with pros and cons for this exhibit. I cheated a little bit. I gave only 1 con and 11 pros of why we should hold it. But that's because I could find only 1 con. So I'd like to take this moment to thank the board of directors of Ivanka for approving this project and for your continued support. Your question, sir.
I'm Rana Sajjad. I have a few questions. What is so unique about Islam that you undertake this project just for Islam? And do you think there is something unique about other faiths and religions that you would think about undertaking this project for other religions? And secondly, the title, American Quran. Do you think at some point you would consider working on European Quran, Asian Quran, or do you think you have to be a resident of those areas to undertake such a project?
Yeah, the title is, and several people comment, and I agree. I don't think it's the best title. A better title would be The Quran for Americans. But it just didn't sound as good to the book publisher. They said American Quran sounds like a better title, and you know, that's fine. The other question was, would I make one? Well, first of all, I don't need to make an illustrated Bible because it's been done for 1,000 years by all kinds of people. And I did spend 5 years doing the Divine Comedy, so I spent 5 years sort of immersed in Dante's Catholic view of the world. And so yeah, I'm interested in maybe Buddhism next, I don't know.
Sandal, Barak, you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's really special to me. Thank you very much.
They'll be around for a little bit. It's 8/26, which is my birthday. You can get my mailing address for your gifts. The time is 8:26, and we'll have Maghrib prayers downstairs at 8:30. Just don't start right away. Wait for everyone to get there, and those of you who want to pray, we'll meet you downstairs in a few minutes. And lastly, once again, if anyone would like to join Sandal and a few other friends on Divan, that's not a Sabeel event per se, so we are all on our own, except for the artist and his wife and our guest. So we'll see you there. Thank you so much for coming.
It is a beautiful work. I would like to say that it's very eclectic, and the children, my children and other American children, Muslim children, will find it very interesting, very engaging. To look at it, they will relate to the Quranic verses and to their daily life. Outstanding work. Our heartfelt congratulations to the artist.
Especially like about the artist's work is when it falls into the border like this, when it breaks the rules and goes off into here, and it did it over here too. It just draws me in even more. All of them inspire. When the artist chose to do that, to bring it off the page, and there's several, it's particularly engaging.
Express how much I appreciated Sandal Burke's work, generally speaking, and also how much I appreciated hearing his presentation here at Sabeel Center. We're actually standing in front of the original painting and manuscript for a surah called The Apartments. In English, the translation is The Apartments. And this is actually a surah that I taught to junior high kids in Sunday school at the Web Foundation. And what we have here, and this was just explained to me by Rizwan, is we actually have the childhood home of the artist here in Detroit. So you've got that kind of classic Midwestern winter of Detroit, but then you've also got this mosque on the side here, which apparently doesn't his childhood home. But what he's trying to do here is he's trying to give you a modern overlay and a modern application for the content of the book, which in this case is a surah about the etiquette of entering people's apartments and being considerate, and it has some very specific context in the Prophet's life. So
Anyway, tremendous and very creative work, one that I truly appreciated, and I appreciated Sabeel bringing him here. For further reading, I would suggest Professor Zarina Grewal's piece in Slate.com. I think it really gives a wonderful overview. And I also really appreciated the introduction by Marcia Hermanson of this piece when she reminded people that Islam came as a new and strange set of ideas, and you know, and in this very famous saying by the Prophet, he says, you know, basically that strangeness is something to be celebrated. So really, really wonderful presentation and a really tremendous piece of art to make the Qur'an have an application in American society generally.